OMG. Your soulmate cut someone off after finding out this about you. Listen to this carefully, because this message is for you, and your heart needs this right now. Something began happening long before anyone noticed it. It started with a feeling your soulmate couldn't explain, a quiet sense that there was more to you than what they had been told. At first, they ignored it. They listened to opinions, accepted stories, and trusted the perspectives of people around them because it felt easier than questioning everything. But life has a strange way of revealing the truth when the timing is right. And listen to this, the more they observed you, the more they realized that your actions consistently told a different story. They noticed how you carried yourself through difficult situations. They noticed how you stayed kind when others became negative. They noticed how you remained loyal even when nobody would have blamed you for walking away. And your heart needs this right now because those moments were not dramatic. They were quiet. They were natural. They were genuine. And genuine things leave the deepest impression. Every time they witnessed another example of your character, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Every time they saw your integrity in action, another doubt disappeared. They began realizing that what people said about you and who you actually were did not always match. And listen to this, that realization made them uncomfortable at first. Nobody likes discovering that their understanding of someone may have been incomplete. Nobody enjoys admitting that they may have accepted opinions without seeing the full picture. But the truth kept appearing. It appeared in the way you treated people. It appeared in the way you handled challenges. It appeared in the consistency of your behavior. And your heart needs this right now because consistency is difficult to fake. Anyone can create a good impression once. Anyone can say the right thing for a moment. But true character reveals itself over time. That is what your soulmate was seeing. The more they paid attention, the more respect they felt. The more respect they felt, the more they questioned the voices that had influenced them before. They started replaying conversations in their mind. They started remembering comments people had made. They started asking themselves why certain individuals seemed determined to focus on negatives while ignoring everything positive. And listen to this, those questions would not go away. They followed your soulmate everywhere. During quiet moments. During reflection. During times when they were completely alone with their thoughts. The more they thought about it, the more obvious everything became. Reality was showing them one version of you, while other people had shown them another. Eventually, they reached a point where they could no longer ignore the contradiction. They could no longer pretend both versions were equally true. And your heart needs this right now because that was the moment everything began changing. The truth about you was becoming stronger than the opinions surrounding you. The respect they felt for you was becoming stronger than the doubts they once carried. Their trust in their own observations was becoming stronger than the influence of other voices. And although they had not yet made any major decisions, something important had already happened. Their perspective had shifted. Their understanding had deepened. Their eyes had opened. And once someone truly sees the truth for themselves, it becomes impossible to go back to believing the illusion they accepted before. Don't skip. Listen to this carefully. This message is for you, and your heart needs this right now, because after everything they had recently discovered, your soulmate found themselves standing at a crossroads they never expected to reach. The truth about you had already started changing the way they thought, but now it was beginning to change the way they felt as well. And listen to this, every new realization seemed to connect to another realization. Every answer created another question. Every moment of clarity revealed something they had overlooked before. They started noticing how often certain people in their life seemed determined to keep old narratives alive even when those narratives no longer matched reality. They started noticing how some individuals appeared more interested in being right than being honest. And your heart needs this right now, because once someone begins seeing these patterns, it becomes difficult to ignore them. The more they reflected, the more they realized that the truth about you was exposing much bigger truths about the people around them. They began thinking back to conversations they once accepted without question. They began remembering moments where doubts had been planted in their mind. They began asking themselves why those doubts existed in the first place. And listen to this, the answers were not always comfortable. Sometimes the people we trust are not intentionally trying to mislead us, but they speak from their own fears, their own insecurities, or their own limited understanding. Sometimes opinions become louder than facts. Sometimes assumptions become stronger than reality. And your heart needs this right now, because your soulmate was beginning to understand the difference. They were beginning to recognize that what they personally witnessed carried more weight than what they had merely been told. The more they trusted their own experiences, the less influence certain voices seemed to have. The more they observed your character, the harder it became to take criticism about you seriously. The more they saw your consistency, the more obvious the contradictions became. And listen to this, there were moments when they wanted to dismiss these thoughts because questioning old beliefs is exhausting. It forces people to admit they may have misunderstood things. It forces people to reevaluate relationships they once felt comfortable with. But your heart needs this right now, because growth rarely happens inside comfort zones. Growth happens when people are willing to face difficult truths. Growth happens when people stop choosing convenience over honesty. And that is exactly where your soulmate found themselves. They were no longer looking for reasons to doubt you. They were looking for reasons to trust what they had already seen. They were no longer trying to protect old assumptions. They were trying to understand reality as clearly as possible. And listen to this. The deeper they looked, the more they admired qualities about you that had gone unnoticed before. They admired your resilience. They admired your ability to stay true to yourself even when others misunderstood you. They admired the way you carried yourself through challenges without constantly seeking validation. They admired the fact that your actions remained consistent regardless of who was watching. And your heart needs this right now, because genuine character creates lasting impressions. It leaves evidence everywhere. It reveals itself naturally over time. That is why the truth became impossible for them to ignore. Every experience reinforced it. Every observation strengthened it. Every reflection confirmed it. And listen to this, while all of this was happening, the emotional distance they once felt toward certain people started growing. Not because of anger. Not because of resentment. But because they could no longer relate to perspectives that seemed disconnected from reality. They started realizing that some relationships were built on assumptions rather than understanding. Some connections were built on influence rather than honesty. Some conversations left them feeling drained instead of inspired. And your heart needs this right now because awareness changes everything. Once someone becomes aware of what supports their peace and what disrupts it, their priorities begin shifting. They start protecting their energy differently. They start choosing their influences more carefully. They start paying attention to what feels authentic and what feels forced. And your soulmate was entering that stage. They were becoming more selective, more thoughtful, more intentional. And with every passing day, they were moving closer to a decision that would not be based on emotion alone, but on everything they had learned, everything they had observed, and everything they could no longer pretend not to know. Don't skip. Listen to this carefully. This message is for you, and your heart needs this right now, because by this stage your soulmate was no longer questioning what they had discovered about you. The uncertainty that once existed had almost completely disappeared. What remained was a growing awareness that the truth they had uncovered was changing more than just their opinion of you, it was changing the way they looked at the people around them. And listen to this. There comes a moment when someone realizes that certain relationships in their life have been influencing their thoughts for far longer than they should have. Not because those relationships are necessarily malicious, but because they are built on assumptions, half-truths, and perspectives that no longer align with reality. Your soulmate was beginning to reach that moment. The more they reflected on everything they had learned about you, the more they noticed how different reality felt compared to the narratives they had once accepted. And your heart needs this right now because every new realization seemed to confirm the same thing. The person they were getting to know through observation, experience, and understanding was not the person some people had described. The more they looked at your actions, the more they saw consistency. The more they looked at your choices, the more they saw integrity. The more they looked at the way you handled challenges, the more they saw strength. And listen to this, those qualities were becoming impossible to ignore. They were no longer isolated examples. They had become a pattern. A pattern that repeated itself again and again until it demanded recognition. And your heart needs this right now because patterns create certainty. Anyone can create an impression for a day, a week, or even a month. But genuine character reveals itself through repetition. Genuine character remains steady when circumstances change. Genuine character continues showing up even when nobody is watching. And that is exactly what your soulmate kept witnessing. Every time they expected the old narrative to make sense, reality gave them another reason to question it. Every time they tried to understand why certain people viewed you the way they did, they found themselves returning to the same conclusion. Something wasn't adding up. Something wasn't matching the truth they were seeing for themselves. And listen to this. That realization started creating emotional distance between them and one particular person whose opinions had once carried a great deal of influence. Not because there was an argument. Not because there was a confrontation. But because trust was beginning to change. Trust relies on honesty. Trust relies on consistency. Trust relies on the feeling that someone is helping you understand reality rather than shaping it to fit their own perspective. And your heart needs this right now because your soulmate was beginning to wonder whether that trust had been misplaced. They started looking back at old conversations with new eyes. They started remembering comments that once felt harmless but now seemed loaded with bias. They started questioning whether certain opinions had ever been fair in the first place. And listen to this, those questions were not easy to sit with. Nobody enjoys realizing that someone they trusted may not have been completely objective. Nobody enjoys confronting the possibility that they may have been influenced by someone else's misunderstandings. But growth often begins with uncomfortable awareness. Growth begins when people stop accepting things automatically and start asking deeper questions. And your heart needs this right now because that is exactly what was happening. Your soulmate was asking deeper questions than ever before. Questions about trust. Questions about influence. Questions about why certain people seemed determined to maintain a version of reality that no longer made sense. The more they reflected, the clearer everything became. The more clarity appeared, the less power old assumptions seemed to have. And listen to this, they began noticing how different they felt after certain conversations. Some interactions left them feeling confused, uncertain, and emotionally drained. Other reflections, especially those connected to the truth they had discovered about you, left them feeling calm, clear, and grounded. And your heart needs this right now because those emotional signals matter. They reveal which influences support growth and which influences create unnecessary confusion. Over time, your soulmate could no longer ignore the difference. They started protecting their energy more carefully. They started paying attention to what felt genuine. They started recognizing that not every voice deserves equal influence. And listen to this, while nobody around them may have fully understood what was happening internally, a decision was slowly forming. Not a decision based on anger. Not a decision driven by emotion alone. A decision based on observation, reflection, and truth. They were beginning to understand that continuing to ignore what they had learned would only create more internal conflict. Continuing to trust perspectives that repeatedly contradicted reality would only create more frustration. And your heart needs this right now because once someone reaches that level of awareness, change becomes inevitable. They may move slowly. They may take time to process everything. But they rarely stay exactly where they were before. The truth about you had already transformed the way they saw the situation. It had already transformed the way they saw certain relationships. And with every passing day, they were moving closer to a moment where they would finally choose clarity over confusion, truth over assumption, and authenticity over influence. Don't skip. Listen to this carefully. This message is for you, and your heart needs this right now, because everything your soulmate had been learning was finally leading them toward a moment they could no longer avoid. The questions that once filled their mind were slowly being replaced by answers. The uncertainty that once kept them standing still was beginning to lose its power. And listen to this. There comes a point when someone realizes they have spent too much time doubting what they can clearly see. There comes a point when the truth becomes so obvious that continuing to ignore it feels more difficult than accepting it. Your soulmate was reaching that point. Every experience they had, every observation they made, every reflection they revisited seemed to reinforce the same understanding. The version of you they had discovered through their own eyes felt authentic, consistent, and real. And your heart needs this right now because that realization was creating a powerful contrast. On one side stood the truth they had witnessed for themselves. On the other side stood opinions, assumptions, and influences that no longer seemed as convincing as they once did. The more they compared the two, the more obvious the difference became. Reality felt steady. Certain voices felt uncertain. Reality felt honest. Certain narratives felt incomplete. And listen to this, the deeper they reflected, the more they understood that this situation was never only about you. It was also about trust. It was about deciding whether they would continue allowing other people to shape their perspective or whether they would trust their own judgment. That decision was not easy. For a long time, they wanted to believe that everyone involved had good intentions. They wanted to believe there was a simple explanation for every contradiction. But your heart needs this right now because sometimes growth requires people to accept that not every influence belongs in their future. Sometimes growth requires people to recognize when a relationship creates more confusion than clarity. And that recognition had begun taking root inside them. They started noticing how different they felt after certain conversations. Some interactions left them questioning themselves. Some left them feeling emotionally exhausted. Others left them feeling disconnected from their own instincts. Yet every time they returned to the truth they had discovered, they felt grounded again. They felt calm. They felt certain. And listen to this. Those emotional differences were becoming impossible to ignore. They were showing your soulmate which influences supported their peace and which influences disturbed it. They were showing them which relationships aligned with honesty and which relationships seemed tied to old assumptions. And your heart needs this right now because awareness changes people. Once someone becomes aware of what is helping them grow and what is holding them back, they rarely remain the same. They begin making different choices. They begin setting different boundaries. They begin protecting their energy more carefully. That is exactly what was happening. Your soulmate was becoming more selective about who they trusted, more thoughtful about whose advice they accepted, and more determined to follow what they knew to be true. And listen to this, while nobody else may have fully understood the internal journey they were going through, a quiet decision was already taking shape. Not a decision made in anger. Not a decision fueled by revenge. A decision built on reflection, self-respect, and clarity. They were beginning to understand that staying connected to influences that repeatedly contradicted reality would only create more frustration in the future. They were beginning to understand that protecting their peace sometimes means creating distance where distance is needed. And your heart needs this right now because the truth about you had become the catalyst for that realization. It had shown them the difference between assumption and reality. It had shown them the importance of trusting their own observations. It had shown them that authenticity always reveals itself over time. And with every passing day, they were moving closer to acting on what they had learned, leaving behind what no longer aligned with their understanding and moving toward a future guided by clarity instead of confusion. Don't skip. Listen to this carefully. This message is for you, and your heart needs this right now, because everything your soulmate had been experiencing was finally leading toward a moment of complete clarity. For weeks, maybe even longer, they had been collecting pieces of a puzzle without realizing what picture those pieces would eventually create. Every observation, every realization, every moment of reflection had quietly been guiding them toward the same conclusion. And listen to this. There comes a point when someone can no longer ignore what their heart and mind have both accepted as true. There comes a point when continuing to doubt reality requires more energy than simply accepting it. Your soulmate had reached that point. The truth they discovered about you had become stronger than every assumption they once carried. The respect they felt for you had become stronger than every doubt that had previously existed. And your heart needs this right now because they were beginning to understand that discovering the truth about you had also revealed something important about themselves. It revealed how much they had relied on outside perspectives. It revealed how often they had allowed other voices to shape their opinions. It revealed how easy it is to accept a narrative when you have never taken the time to verify it for yourself. But now everything was different. They were no longer seeing you through the lens of someone else's interpretation. They were seeing you through their own experiences. They were seeing the consistency in your actions. They were seeing the honesty in your character. They were seeing qualities that could not be manufactured or performed for attention. And listen to this, every time they reflected on what they had learned, they felt the same thing, certainty. Not the loud kind of certainty that demands attention. The quiet kind. The kind that settles deep inside and refuses to leave. The kind that changes the way people make decisions. The kind that changes who they trust and who they allow into their lives. And your heart needs this right now because one particular relationship in their life was beginning to feel more and more out of alignment with everything they had come to understand. The conversations no longer felt the same. The influence no longer felt the same. The trust no longer felt as strong as it once did. Not because of one dramatic event, but because of countless small realizations that kept pointing in the same direction. They began noticing how often certain interactions left them feeling uncertain instead of clear. They began noticing how often they felt pressured to accept perspectives that no longer matched reality. They began noticing how exhausting it had become to ignore what they already knew deep down. And listen to this, that awareness was creating a powerful shift inside them. For the first time, they stopped asking themselves what other people wanted them to believe. Instead, they started asking themselves what they knew to be true. They stopped seeking approval for their conclusions. They stopped looking for permission to trust their own observations. And your heart needs this right now because that is where real growth begins. Growth begins when people trust themselves enough to acknowledge what they have learned. Growth begins when people choose authenticity over comfort. Growth begins when people stop protecting old illusions and start embracing reality. And that is exactly what your soulmate was doing. Every day, their confidence in the truth grew stronger. Every day, their attachment to outdated assumptions grew weaker. Every day, they moved closer to a decision that once seemed impossible. And listen to this, when that decision finally arrived, it did not feel dramatic. It did not feel chaotic. It did not feel emotional in the way people might expect. Instead, it felt peaceful. It felt necessary. It felt like the natural result of everything they had discovered. Because sometimes the most important choices in life are not made in moments of anger. They are made in moments of clarity. Moments when a person finally understands what belongs in their future and what does not. Moments when they finally understand which relationships support their growth and which relationships keep them trapped in old patterns. And your heart needs this right now because your soulmate was entering exactly that kind of moment. They were no longer focused on what they were losing. They were focused on what they were gaining: peace, understanding, confidence, and the freedom that comes from living in alignment with the truth. And as they looked ahead, they realized that this journey had never really been about cutting someone off. It had been about opening their eyes. It had been about recognizing authenticity when they saw it. It had been about learning to trust their own experiences. And most importantly, it had been about discovering that the truth about you was far more powerful than anything they had been told before. Don't skip. Listen to this carefully. This message is for you, and your heart needs this right now, because this is the moment where everything finally comes together. For so long, your soulmate had been collecting pieces of a story without realizing where that story was leading. They thought they were simply learning more about you. They thought they were simply correcting old assumptions. They thought they were simply gaining a clearer understanding of the situation. But listen to this. What they were really discovering was a truth that would completely change the direction of their life. Every observation, every realization, every moment of reflection had quietly been guiding them toward the same destination. And your heart needs this right now because there comes a point when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. There comes a point when someone can no longer pretend they do not see what is standing right in front of them. Your soulmate had reached that point. The person they once thought they understood was no longer the person they saw when they looked at you. Instead, they saw someone whose actions consistently revealed honesty, strength, loyalty, and character. They saw someone who remained true to themselves despite misunderstandings. They saw someone who continued moving forward without needing constant validation from others. And listen to this, the more they understood those qualities, the more they began understanding something else. The issue was never you. The issue was the lens through which they had been encouraged to see you. Once that lens disappeared, everything changed. Every old assumption started losing its power. Every old doubt started fading away. Every old narrative began collapsing under the weight of reality. And your heart needs this right now because reality has a way of winning eventually. It may take time. It may take patience. It may require people to learn lessons the hard way. But genuine truth cannot remain hidden forever. And your soulmate was finally experiencing that truth for themselves. They were no longer relying on someone else's interpretation. They were no longer allowing other voices to decide what they should believe. They were trusting what they had personally witnessed. They were trusting their own experiences. They were trusting their own instincts. And listen to this, that trust created a level of clarity they had not felt in a very long time. Suddenly, certain relationships look different. Certain conversations look different. Certain influences looked different. They began recognizing how much energy they had spent maintaining connections that no longer aligned with what they knew to be true. They began recognizing how often they had ignored their own intuition to keep the peace. They began recognizing how exhausting it was to stay connected to people who repeatedly created confusion instead of understanding. And your heart needs this right now because awareness changes priorities. Once someone sees clearly, they begin protecting their peace differently. They begin choosing authenticity over appearances. They begin valuing honesty over comfort. That is exactly what was happening. The person who once influenced them so strongly no longer held the same position in their life. Not because of hatred. Not because of revenge. Not because of bitterness. But because the connection no longer felt aligned with reality. And listen to this, when the final decision arrived, it felt surprisingly calm. There was no dramatic confrontation. No emotional explosion. No desperate attempt to explain everything. Instead, there was acceptance. Acceptance that some relationships serve a purpose for a season and then come to an end. Acceptance that growth sometimes requires distance. Acceptance that protecting your peace is not selfish when the alternative is constantly betraying what you know to be true. And your heart needs this right now because your soulmate finally understood that lesson. They understood that letting go of certain influences was not a loss. It was a step forward. It was a decision to trust themselves. It was a decision to honor the truth they had discovered. And listen to this, the most important realization of all came afterward. After the distance. After the clarity. After the decision had been made. They realized that this entire journey had never really been about cutting someone off. It had been about opening their eyes. It had been about learning to see people for who they truly are instead of who others claim they are. It had been about learning to trust experience over assumption. It had been about learning that authenticity always reveals itself in time. And your heart needs this right now because the truth they discovered about you became the catalyst for all of it. It became the reason they questioned old narratives. It became the reason they trusted themselves more. It became the reason they finally chose clarity over confusion. And now, as they move forward, they carry a completely different perspective than the one they started with. A perspective built on reality, built on understanding, and built on the undeniable realization that some discoveries change far more than opinions, they change entire lives.